Jax's revenge domain. I was speaking when Brandon Walsh smiled, raised one finger, and stopped me cold in front of the board. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't want context. He wanted silence. Just an old-school paper pusher, he said casually, like labeling outdated equipment. And the room accepted it without protest or hesitation. My name is Gary Peterson. I'm 55 years old, and I've been doing contract analysis for North Point Industries for 18 years. Today, I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there because details break companies when ignored. As senior contract analyst, I tracked agreements, timelines, and risks. Brandon collected applause and titles. I collected errors before they became disasters. Quietly, repeatedly, during meetings, emails, weekends, audits, reviews. Alone, unseen, unrecognized. The meeting moved on without me. Charts advanced, voices overlapped. Brandon spoke about speed, innovation, disruption. I had flagged a regulatory compliance issue that morning regarding our $280 million acquisition of Regional Supply Corp. He never looked at it. In his world, authority replaced reading and confidence replaced verification, especially from someone like me who asked inconvenient questions professionally. That stung, but I kept my mouth shut. No termination followed immediately, no paperwork, just subtraction. My voice removed, my role minimized, my value erased by a sentence delivered for effect, not accuracy. While others avoided my eyes and pretended this was leadership somehow, Brandon thrived on hierarchy. Titles were shields. He trusted volume over substance. I trusted margins, footnotes, and consequences. That difference sat between us. Everyone could feel it. No one addressed it. When the meeting ended, people filed past me like I'd become invisible mid-sentence. Brandon didn't look back. He didn't need to. He'd already won the room. I stayed seated, listening to the hum of decisions made too quickly to survive scrutiny. Before leaving, I gathered my notes. One document sat where it shouldn't have, untouched, overlooked. I didn't announce it. I didn't highlight it. I simply slid it into my folder and stood up. Silence can be useful, especially when everyone underestimates you after calling you just an old-school paper pusher publicly. I didn't leave the building angry that day. Anger would have been too simple. What stayed with me was the weight of being erased after years of quietly holding things together. That weight had been building long before Brandon decided my voice was optional. It had been accumulating in emails never answered, meetings where my notes were used but my presence ignored, and decisions credited to the loudest person in the room. I had spent nearly 2 decades operating behind Brandon's confidence. When contracts arrived late, I stayed. When deadlines collapsed, I rebuilt them. I learned how our suppliers operated, how our regulators thought, and where our legal exposure hid. I wasn't trained for applause. I was trained for prevention. And prevention rarely leaves fingerprints. Brandon loved momentum and bold language. When deals closed cleanly, he praised his instincts. When something nearly failed, he praised his leadership for catching it early. No one asked who caught it. No one asked why the same issues kept disappearing before they reached his desk. I learned early that correcting him publicly wasn't rewarded. Quiet fixes were safer for him and for the company. There were moments that should have mattered. A supplier certification that didn't match updated standards. A compliance filing that missed regulatory changes. A contract clause buried so deep it would have surfaced only during litigation. Each time I intervened quietly. Each time Brandon walked away looking decisive. Each time my name stayed out of it. What made it worse wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the assumption that my work was automatic, incidental, replaceable. Brandon began referring to me as support, even when I was the one explaining consequences to his legal team. In meetings, he summarized points I had drafted hours earlier, reshaping them as spontaneous insights. People nodded. I stayed silent. The imbalance sharpened over time. New executives joined and never learned what I did. They learned what Brandon said I did. That difference mattered. It meant I was invisible when things went right and exposed when something needed blame. The structure rewarded confidence, not accuracy. And Brandon knew how to use that to his advantage. Still, I stayed, not out of loyalty to him, but to the system I understood better than anyone else. I knew how the contracts linked together. I knew how one signature affected another department 3 steps away. I understood the regulatory chain not as documents, but as consequences. No one else had ever taken the time to map it fully. That knowledge became isolating. It sat with me during long evenings and early mornings. It followed me into meetings where I listened more than I spoke. By the time he dismissed my warning in that room, it wasn't the first time he had dismissed me. It was just the first time he did it out loud. And as I walked back to my desk afterward, one thought stayed steady beneath the resentment. I wasn't just a witness to how this company worked. I was the only person who truly understood how everything connected. At 55, with 7 years left until I could collect my full pension, I needed this job. My wife Sarah had been dealing with medical issues since her surgery last year. The bills were manageable, but only if my paycheck kept coming. Brandon knew this. We all knew he knew this. That realization would matter later when silence stopped protecting them and started protecting me instead. I found the mistake late, not because it was hidden, but because no one else slowed down enough to see it. The acquisition documents were already circulating, stamped urgent, pushed through inboxes like a race everyone pretended was strategic. I stayed after hours reviewing the language, not out of suspicion, but out of habit, built from years of cleaning up avoidable messes. The compliance issue appeared harmless at first glance, wrapped in technical phrasing and references to legacy agreements. But when I followed the cross-references, a pattern formed. Regional Supply Corp had been flagged by the EPA for potential violations 6 months ago. The investigation was still pending. If triggered during our acquisition, the provision would require immediate operational halt and full environmental audit. It was rare, overlooked, and still legally binding. Worse, it didn't require employee status to activate. It required proper notification to the regulatory body. My stomach tightened as I traced the implications. The entire acquisition depended on uninterrupted operations during transition. Lose that, and the deal collapsed. Penalties followed, litigation followed, reputation damage followed. I checked the numbers again, then checked the language again. The risk wasn't theoretical, it was real. I requested a meeting with Brandon that same morning. I kept my explanation simple and direct. I pointed to the section, the references, the exposure. He listened for less than a minute before leaning back. He said we didn't have time for hypotheticals. He said legal had reviewed it. He said speed mattered more than caution. And then he reminded me that I wasn't positioned to question strategy. The dismissal landed harder than I expected, not because he disagreed, but because he never actually looked. The decision had already been made. Momentum had become a substitute for thinking. I watched him move on to timelines and press messaging while the risk sat untouched between us. After that, the building felt quieter. Not calm, just indifferent. I sent a follow-up email outlining the issue, attaching supporting documentation. It was acknowledged by an assistant and buried under scheduling requests. No escalation followed. No questions came back. The silence was procedural, not accidental. I spent the rest of the day searching for an error that would make me wrong. I wanted to be wrong. Being wrong would mean safety, but the more I tested it, the more solid it became. The compliance issue survived every scenario. That realization isolated me completely. I understood something that no one wanted to understand because understanding it would slow everything down. Brandon had chosen acceleration. The company followed. I was left standing with a problem that didn't care about hierarchy or confidence. As evening settled, one final detail locked into place. The regulatory trigger activated upon filing completion, not approval. That meant once the process began, oversight shifted immediately. I sat back, exhausted, aware that the warning phase was over. What remained was inevitability. And the dangerous part was this: the mistake would not disappear when I did. The email arrived without ceremony. No subject line designed to soften the impact. No request to talk. Just a block of text waiting. When I opened my inbox, it was written in the careful language companies use when they want distance more than clarity. It informed me that my position was being eliminated, effective immediately. Further instructions would follow. They always say that even when there are no instructions worth following. There was no meeting, no confrontation. Brandon didn't appear. He didn't need to. This wasn't personal anymore. It was administrative, clean, efficient, final. The kind of decision made when leadership wants something removed without friction or witnesses. An hour later, Patricia Collins from HR appeared at my desk with a printed copy of the same email. She didn't sit. She didn't apologize. She read it aloud like a weather report, eyes fixed just past my shoulder. When she finished, she asked for my badge and company laptop. Her voice was steady, practiced. I handed them over without hesitation. Resistance would have changed nothing. As she walked away, my screen refreshed on its own. The access prompt flashed once, then disappeared. My credentials were gone. Shared drives, calendars, internal systems, 18 years of work sealed off by a process that took less than a minute. I understood how thoroughly a company can erase someone without raising its voice. I packed slowly, not because I needed time, but because I felt nothing urging me to hurry. The office continued around me, keyboards clicking, conversations half-whispered. No one asked what happened. No one wanted to know. Silence wasn't cruelty. It was compliance. Walking out felt strangely ordinary. No escort, no scene, just the quiet awareness that my name no longer belonged to that structure. The identity I had carried for nearly 2 decades dissolved into something smaller and heavier. Outside, the weight settled. I wasn't processing betrayal or shock. I was processing acceptance. The decision had been made days ago. The email was just confirmation. At home, I placed the box on the table and sat beside it, staring at nothing in particular. Sarah looked up from her crossword puzzle. "How was your day?" she asked, not noticing the box at first. "Different," I said. That was when a detail surfaced, uninvited but clear. The termination timestamp, the language in the notice. By severing my employment immediately, the company had altered my legal position. I wasn't bound by internal escalation policies anymore. I wasn't constrained by reporting chains. I wasn't required to defer concerns upward and wait. The safeguards designed to control employee behavior no longer applied. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but systems are built on small things. That change activated something I had been reviewing days earlier. Not intentionally, not strategically, simply as a consequence of how the company chose to remove me. The realization didn't bring satisfaction, it brought clarity. There's a difference. When an organization cuts you loose without thought, it often cuts its own protections at the same time. Efficiency creates blind spots, speed skips consequences, and decisions made to silence someone can sometimes give them exactly what they need to be heard later. By the end of the evening, my role was gone, but my understanding wasn't. The system that erased me had shifted its own boundaries in the process, and while Brandon believed the problem had been removed, the structure itself had quietly changed shape. I was no longer an employee. I was something else now. I didn't read the contracts as an employee anymore. That distinction mattered. I read them as a private individual with time, distance, and no obligation to protect anyone's pride. The documents felt different without the pressure to summarize them for someone else. There was no urgency now, only structure, language, and consequences waiting to be understood. I spread the papers across my dining table, aligning sections the way I always had, schedules on one side, definitions on the other. The acquisition agreement sat at the center, thick and familiar. I wasn't looking for emotion or validation. I was looking for authority, the kind that exists quietly inside regulatory language. What stood out wasn't a dramatic loophole. It was consistency. The compliance requirement I had flagged before didn't depend on titles, employment, or internal approval. It referenced notification procedures, regulatory timelines, and public interest. Nothing more, nothing less. Authority came from following the rules right, not from where someone sat in the organizational chart. I traced the logic carefully. If a proper notification was submitted, oversight shifted automatically. No discretion, no committee vote, no executive override. The rule didn't care who used it, just how. It assumed someone in charge was paying attention. It assumed wrong. I checked again for restrictions tied to internal roles. There were none. The language was old, inherited from previous transactions, carried forward without revision. It had survived audits, restructures, and leadership changes because it had never been challenged. Everyone trusted the system without reading it closely. That realization didn't trigger excitement. It triggered focus. I wasn't angry enough to rush, and I wasn't afraid enough to hesitate. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about precision. I listed requirements on a legal pad, not to plan a confrontation, but to confirm what was possible. The action required was almost absurdly small, a notification, proper documentation, submission through established channels. The process existed for legitimate oversight, not personal disputes. Yet it didn't care why it was used. It only cared whether it was used correctly. I reviewed everything one more time, then set the papers aside. What struck me most was how little emotion the process required. There was no need for arguments, exposure, or persuasion. The system didn't ask how I felt or what had happened to me. It only asked whether conditions were met. For years, I had been told my role was administrative, supportive, replaceable. Yet the authority sitting on my table had nothing to do with my former title. It existed independently, waiting for someone patient enough to read through what others dismissed. I chose a morning when nothing looked urgent. That mattered. Systems notice anomalies faster when people are calm. I worked from my kitchen table, documents arranged precisely. The action itself was simple. That was the part no one would ever believe. I completed a notification form that already existed. Attached documentation I already possessed and submitted it through the EPA's established whistleblower channel. No speeches, no explanations, no names highlighted, just accuracy, just compliance. I checked every field twice. Dates aligned, references matched. The language mirrored the regulations exactly. I paid the nominal fee required to trigger processing. The system accepted it without hesitation. There was no confirmation email congratulating me, no alert signaling impact, only a neutral case number and a timestamp. That was enough. Procedures don't celebrate, they record. As soon as the submission went through, the clock started running. Not visibly, not dramatically, but legally. Deadlines shifted, conditions activated, dependencies changed. The rule had been designed to move quietly, assuming good faith and limited use. It didn't know why it was being used now. It didn't need to. I didn't contact anyone afterward. That restraint took more effort than the action itself. Any communication would have slowed things down, invited interference, or alerted the wrong people too early. By midday, the first signal appeared, subtle enough that only someone watching would notice. A regulatory database updated its status automatically. No human had touched it yet. The system had simply acknowledged a change in condition and adjusted its records accordingly. People think authority comes before recognition. In reality, recognition comes first. Authority catches up later. Linda Hayes texted me 2 days later. It wasn't detailed. She wrote that outside counsel had been pulled into an emergency review and that everyone looked tense. Lawyers only panic when something threatens structure, not reputation. That told me enough. The acquisition timeline stalled without explanation. Press drafts paused. Approvals that had sailed through suddenly required secondary sign-offs. No one admitted anything was wrong, but the movement stopped. Deals don't freeze for emotional reasons. They freeze because a dependency has shifted somewhere deep inside the framework. Brandon reacted the way he always did when momentum slowed. He pushed harder. He demanded updates, called meetings, asked for assurances he didn't intend to read. Speed had always worked for him before. This time, speed only amplified the silence pushing back. I watched from a distance, not through gossip, but through public signals. Regulatory filings adjusted language. Risk disclosures expanded subtly. An EPA bulletin referenced a procedural trigger without naming it. The system was responding exactly as designed, cautiously and without blame. Inside the company, confusion spread. Legal teams hate uncertainty. It means something is operating outside expectation. I imagined the conference rooms, the binders reopened, the searches for a cause that didn't involve admitting someone had been warned. Brandon still believed this was a temporary slowdown. He treated it like a supply delay or a negotiation tactic. He didn't consider that oversight itself might have shifted. Leaders rarely do. What I found almost interesting was how little noise it made at first. No alerts, no emails announcing a problem, just friction, requests unanswered, decisions deferred. The system doesn't accuse, it constrains. By the end of the week, the tone changed. Advisors stopped offering reassurance and started asking for time. That's when panic enters the room. Not with shouting, but with pauses. When lawyers ask for time, they are measuring damage. Brandon lost his temper publicly for the first time. Not at me, at everyone else. He demanded to know who had slowed the deal and why no one had caught it sooner. No one answered directly because no one knew who to blame. The source wasn't a person anymore. The reaction had moved beyond individuals. It lived inside processes now. The confrontation arrived quietly. A formal notice from the EPA informed North Point Industries that Regional Supply Corp was under active investigation for environmental compliance violations. All acquisition activities must cease pending review completion. The timing was surgical. The notification cited proper procedures, included comprehensive documentation, and referenced established regulatory precedent. There was no angle for dismissal, no shortcut to reversal. Brandon called me sooner than I expected, but later than he should have. That timing told me everything. He didn't reach out when the system first resisted him. He reached out when resistance turned into immobility. The call came through an unrecognized number. When I answered, silence stretched on the line for a second too long, the way it does when someone is deciding which version of themselves to use. Then his voice appeared, smooth, controlled, carrying the same authority he'd relied on for years. "Gary," he said, as if we were picking up a conversation that hadn't ended badly. He started where men like Brandon always start, above the problem. He spoke about misunderstandings, about timing issues, about how things had become unnecessarily complicated. He never apologized. He never acknowledged the dismissal. Instead, he framed the situation as an inconvenience that required cooperation from both sides. I let him talk. Power reveals itself when it does not feel challenged. When that didn't work, his tone shifted. The warmth drained out of his voice, replaced by warning. He reminded me of confidentiality clauses, of reputational risk, of how quickly narratives can turn against people without platforms. He implied consequences without naming them, assuming fear would do the work for him. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I simply listened. Nothing weakens a threat faster than letting it finish without reaction. Then came the pivot. Brandon offered to make things right. Consulting fees, a settlement, a role more appropriate to my experience. He dressed it up as generosity, as if the issue were pride rather than process. That was when I spoke. I told him I wasn't interested in money or titles. I wasn't negotiating. I wasn't angry. I was following the structure he'd approved and ignored. I explained calmly that nothing happening was personal. It was procedural. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't strategic. It was recalculating. Brandon asked one question. Then quietly, "What do you want?" I told him the truth. I wanted nothing from him. The process was already moving. It didn't require permission or discussion. It required compliance. And that window had passed. He pushed back, insisting there had to be a way to reverse it. That's when I realized he still believed this was about leverage between people. I corrected him gently. It wasn't. It was about conditions that had been met and recorded. The call ended shortly after. There were no threats left to make, no offers left to improve. Brandon understood then that the situation had moved beyond emotion, influence, and hierarchy. Regulations don't respond to intimidation. They respond to accuracy. The board didn't take long to act once the EPA notice became official. Emergency meetings were called. Independent counsel was retained. Risk assessment began immediately. The investigation that followed was thorough, professional, and damaging. It revealed not just the compliance issue I had flagged, but a pattern of accelerated decisions that bypassed proper review. Brandon's leadership style, once praised as innovative and decisive, was reframed as reckless and costly. The acquisition collapse triggered penalty clauses worth $12 million. Stock price dropped 8% in 3 days. When the board's review concluded, the changes were swift and comprehensive. Brandon was reassigned to a strategic advisory role with significantly reduced authority. The position was described as a lateral move, but everyone understood. New protocols were implemented requiring mandatory review periods for major transactions. Compliance oversight was expanded and given independent reporting authority. The company had learned something expensive and rare. 3 weeks after the EPA investigation began, Howard Jenkins, the board chair, called me directly. The conversation was brief, respectful, and unexpected. He offered me the newly created position of Director of Risk Management, reporting directly to the board with authority over all major transaction reviews. The role came with a 30% salary increase and comprehensive benefits. More importantly, it came with protection. No department head could override my assessments without board approval. No timeline could bypass my review period. No executive could dismiss my warnings without documented justification. I accepted, not because I needed vindication, but because the position could prevent future mistakes. The role wasn't about revenge. It was about structure. When I returned to North Point Industries, the dynamic had completely shifted. Former colleagues who had avoided eye contact now sought my approval. Executives who had dismissed my input now requested my guidance. Brandon remained with the company, but our interactions were minimal and professional. There was no hostility, no tension, just acknowledgement of new boundaries. The most satisfying part wasn't watching him fall. It was watching the system finally work the way it was supposed to. Decisions slowed down just enough to be deliberate. Questions were asked before problems developed. Prevention was no longer invisible. It had become valuable, measurable, and protected. The company began avoiding mistakes instead of managing crises. 3 months later, I was reviewing contracts in my new office when Linda Hayes knocked on my door. She held a folder containing documents for another potential acquisition. "Gary," she said with a slight smile, "we'd like your assessment before we proceed." I opened the folder and began reading, noting the careful language, the proper cross-references, the deliberate pacing of the timeline. This was how things were supposed to work. The system had corrected itself, and I was no longer fighting against it. I was part of it, protected by it, and trusted to maintain it. That transformation wasn't dramatic or emotional, it was simply professional, and in the end, that's what mattered most. Not revenge, not vindication, but respect earned through competence and sustained through structure. The lesson isn't complicated. Experience has value that can't be replicated, only accumulated. When someone calls you obsolete, outdated, or past your prime, remember this: they're measuring age, not ability. The real victory wasn't Brandon's downfall, it was the system's recognition that patience and precision matter more than speed and confidence. That understanding doesn't fade with age, it grows stronger. Follow the steps right, get the result. Simple.